Hey y'all, it's entry number 90 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Cordarrelle Patterson, running back, Atlanta Falcons. We'll start with some of the positives with Cordarrelle Patterson's fantasy profile: versatility and dual threat. Patterson has always had the raw talent on the football field, but until last year, teams had struggled to figure out the best way to utilize him. During the 2021 season, Cordarrelle Patterson carried the ball 153 times for 618 rushing yards and 6 rushing touchdowns on the ground, and caught 52 passes on 69 targets for 548 receiving yards and 5 receiving touchdowns through the air, according to Pro Football Reference. He was one of the more efficient receivers at the running back position, averaging 10.5 yards per reception, the second best among running backs, and 2.32 yards per route run, the second best among running backs according to Player Profiler. The next thing I really like about Cordarrelle Patterson's fantasy profile is the fact that he was an RB1 in 2021. During the 2021 season, Patterson finished as the RB12 in standard, with 182.6 total fantasy points and 11.4 fantasy points per game, the RB9 in half PPR formats, with 208.6 total fantasy points and 13.0 fantasy points per game, and the RB9 in full PPR formats, with 234.6 total fantasy points and 14.7 fantasy points per game, according to Fantasy Pros. He was relatively consistent on a week-to-week basis as well. In half PPR formats during the 2021 season, Cordarrelle Patterson had 3 out of 16 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 3 out of 16 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 5 out of 16 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 2 out of 16 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 1 out of 16 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, and 2 out of 16 games with over 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. Patterson's strong 2021 season shows what kind of ceiling he may be capable of when playing in Arthur Smith's offense. The last major thing I really like about Cordarrelle Patterson's fantasy profile this year is his per touch efficiency last year. Patterson was pretty efficient in 2021, ranking 5th among running backs in fantasy points per opportunity with 1.06, and 6th among running backs in yards per touch with 5.7 according to Player Profiler. Being relatively efficient is a good sign for Patterson's fantasy prospects. Moving on to some of the concerns with Cordarrelle Patterson's fantasy profile. Possible one-year wonder. Prior to the 2021 season, Cordarrelle Patterson's previous career high in scrimmage yards was 627, all the way back in his rookie year in 2013. It's pretty rare to see a player break out in their 9th season in the league, and it's possible that Patterson is just a fun one-year wonder from a fantasy perspective. The next concern I have with Cordarrelle Patterson's fantasy profile is the fact that he's an older running back. Cordarrelle Patterson is slated to be one of the oldest lead backs in the NFL going into the 2022 season, at age 31. Even though he doesn't have a ton of touches under his belt, which may help with his longevity, he's past the age that most running backs decline, age 28, according to Mike Tagliere. So there's definitely a possibility that he falls off a cliff in 2022. The last major concern I have with Cordarrelle Patterson's fantasy profile is the fact that he's got a bad offensive line. The Atlanta Falcons' offensive line ranked 27th in the league last year according to Pro Football Focus. They are projected to have all 5 of the same starters, and the offensive line is projected to rank as the 28th best offensive line in the league according to Pro Football Focus for 2022. Having a subpar offensive line will make it more difficult for Patterson to be successful as a runner. Some additional thoughts on Cordarrelle Patterson's fantasy profile. Cordarrelle Patterson landed on the NFL Players Top 100 list for the first time of his career in 2022, ranking 73rd. New quarterback. The Atlanta Falcons will have a new starting quarterback in 2022 as they go from Matt Ryan to Marcus Mariota. New competition for targets. The Atlanta Falcons drafted wide receiver Drake London in the first round of the 2022 NFL Draft. This addition may impact Patterson's target share in 2022. Besides Cordarrelle Patterson, the other Atlanta Falcons running back on the depth chart include Damian Williams and Tyler Algier. Coaching. The Atlanta Falcons head coach Arthur Smith has gotten pretty good production out of his running back room over the course of his career. Cordarrelle Patterson broke tackles just 7.8% of the time, which was on the lower end for a running back according to RotoWire. Personal opinion. Cordarrelle Patterson is currently going off the board as RB28, about pick 90 overall on ESPN, and RB34, about pick 96 overall on Yahoo. What seems like the most realistic scenario to me is that Cordarrelle Patterson retains a pass-catching role on the Falcons, since that's really where he thrived last year, but his carries get scaled back as the season goes on, since his rushing statistics aren't very impressive and guys like Damian Williams and Tyler Algier are likely better suited to the role, particularly on goal line carries. Because of this, I think at his current price, he's an okay player, not great to take a shot on in PPR formats at his current ADP if you believe in him, since he doesn't cost much and his floor should be a little higher in that format. But in standard, I have very little interest in him this year. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Cordarrelle Patterson's My Cause My Cleats was for pregnancy and infant loss awareness. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.